EAP and 802.1X not only are fun things to say, but they are great authentication methods that we need to be aware of how they work for the Security Plus exam. Good news is we're having that conversation starting right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV, and today is all about two wonderful authentication protocols. One of them known as EAP, the other 802.1X, a little more formalized in its naming convention, but we do need to understand how they work and what we need to use them for when it comes to Security Plus exam. So Wes, you're going to help us out with that today. I say we hit the ground running with some EAP, better known as
EAP. That's right. Yeah. You know, the reason I had to say EAP, the reason I had to say EAP is I just got done watching the movie Grood.
Oh,
Groods,
yeah.
And
How
the
was
daughter's
that?
name, it's the newer one, New Age. Oh, it's a great movie. Okay. But the daughter's name is Eep.
Oh,
so when
really?
you're saying
That's
Eep,
funny.
I'm like thinking, oh, okay, here goes the cartoon. No, but what Dan's talking about is something known as the Extensible Authentication Protocol. All right, now, what is an Extensible Authentication Protocol? Well, it's actually a framework, and that's something that we have to know, and we have to know that it's used in wireless networks. Now, let's stay on that authentication framework for a second. What does that actually mean? Well, it's actually, think of it as a container, all right? And this container can transport authentication technologies, if you will, all right? It doesn't do the authentication itself. All right, and really, it's an extension of PPP, expands on PPP. See, in the earlier days of PPP, the point-to-point protocol that we've talked about, there was really only a couple of authentication mechanisms that were available. One that we mentioned already, Password Authentication Protocol, and CHAP. All right, well, those were kind of restricted in what they could, their capabilities and where we can use them, and the technology would progress. So we needed a way, or I should say the engineers, if you will, that make brilliant minds that make this stuff, said, hey, we need something that's not so much future-proofed, but that we can, and here's the name, extend, if you will. We can extend its functionality over time. All right, and that's where EAP comes in, and it's used primarily in wireless networks. That was one of the big things it was used for, is how do we provide a strong level of authentication inside of wireless networks and leave a little bit of room for growth in the future as well.
Wes, is this the protocol that allows us to work with, like, say if I'm in an Active Directory domain, I'm then able to use my Active Directory username and password to authenticate to the wireless?
You can. It's commonly used inside of things like with Radius as well too. So there are many different types of EAP, and well, there's so many different types. I don't want you to sit here and try to learn all of them. And what I mean by types, I want you to think of those authentication types as flavors. I like to think of them as flavors, right? Ice cream, whatever, I love food. But they're also known as EAP types or EAP methods, if you will. And there's more than one. There are a bunch of them. But there are a few that they call out on the exam that I want you to be aware of. I'll mention another one here since I mentioned Radius as well, too. But when we talk about EAP, all right, again, you're going to notice that the EAP is then attached to whatever the authentication technology is, right? So we have what's known as EAP Fast. And Fast, if you will, is just flexible authentication via secure tunneling, if you will. It's essentially a protocol that was developed by Cisco, and it's used in wireless networks and, imagine this, point-to-point communications, right? Again, expanding on PPP, if you will. And it performs session authentication. That is one that I want you to know. Know that it's used, it's a Cisco technology, and where it's used. So one of the goals, for this episode and for your success on the exam is to know, given a scenario, where do you implement these protocols? Again, primarily we're talking about wireless, but not all of it has to be wireless. For instance, EAP TLS. All right, you've probably seen, if you've been following along, Dan and I have talked about transport layer security and what it does, right? EAP TLS, this is a way that you can do certificate-based authentication, mutual authentication, smart card authentication, token-based authentication. So you can see how the EAP methods really allow you to expand the capabilities, the authentication mechanisms that you use, rather than just being tied to what those early two were. Again, PAP and CHAP.
Seems like that would make this a very popular protocol to be using because of its ability to kind of be useful wherever you need it.
It is, and I'll tell you, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dan. Focus on what Dan just said there. The EAP TLS is one of the most commonly used EAP methods in existence today. So it is one of the major methods. And again, for the exam, where do I use this? If I need to implement TLS, EAP TLS more importantly, if you have to do certificate-based authentication, because we've talked about mutual authentication. Mutual authentication, let's say Dan's holding like a resource that I want. Hey, Dan, I need the resource. Oh, show me your driver's license. Okay. Dan, why don't you show me your driver's license so I know that I'm talking to Dan? Right? It's mutual. It's on both sides of the endpoints, and EAP TLS allows us to do that. Now, there's another one here that kind of expands on EAP TLS, and it's called TTLS, if you will. So what does that mean? Well, that is the Extensible Authentication Protocol, and it's a tunneled transport layer security. It is an extension of EAP TLS, if you will, and it was invented for basically creating a secure tunnel, if you will, and then once that secure tunnel is established, you then send encrypted authentication method or mechanism, the authentication itself, between the endpoints. Now, I want you to know this didn't gain support in the Microsoft world. In Windows, it wasn't supported up to Windows 7. You had to get like a third-party extension to be able to use it. As of Windows 8, which I know we are pretty happy it's gone. Windows 8 wasn't that great. But as of Windows 8 and beyond, EAP TTLS is still used. So be aware of the methods that we've talked about here. Now, I'm telling you, there are a lot of them. If you go out, you can go pause the video, go out to Wikipedia, and just type in Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, and you're going to see there's probably about 15 of them up there.
Yeah, I've actually did that very thing. I'm looking at Leap. I'm looking at EAP Fast. I see
Leap. Now, Leap was lightweight extensible authentication protocol, and that one, it was actually, if I remember right, was developed by Cisco, and it was a temporary stopgap in wireless networks in the days when we knew WEP was basically, WEP wasn't good, and you'll see that. When we get into our wireless security sections, we'll talk a little bit more about WEP and WPA and WPA2 and WPA3 now. But Cisco knew that WEP, wired equivalent privacy, it was weak. It was very vulnerable. So what they did is they said, all right, you know what we're going to do, lightweight extensible authentication protocol, we're basically going to kind of use like WEP, and what we're going to do is we're going to basically issue a WEP key, new WEP key for every frame or packet, if you will, that goes across the network. I guess technically it would be frames because it's at the wireless level, so it's not, we're not talking about the network layer of the OSI model here. And what it would do is it would just, every packet that you, or frame that you would send would have a new encryption key. Now that's kind of a precursor to what would end up being built in WPA, which was the Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, which did that anyway. So that was more of the earlier days. You know, it was something that was really just for Cisco, and it's not really used today. There's other ones too, which is protected EAP. Now protected EAP, PEEP, if you will, is the one that without the authentication mechanisms attached on it, this framework says, yeah, I'll transport those authentication mechanisms for you, but before we do that, we're going to establish an encrypted tunnel. And every method that uses PEEP, that secure tunnel is created first. I'm trying to think, you probably have some other ones in there too.
Oh, it was
like
a laundry list.
EAP MD5, right? That's basically for integrity.
EAP POTP.
Yeah, Radius.
EAP PSK, EAP PWB. I'm sorry, PWD.
Yeah.
There's TTLS, IKE v2.
Yep, that's the Internet Key Exchange version 2, which means basically what they're doing is they're taking IKE as part of IPsec and they're attaching EAP to the front of it.
We could literally just keep going. There are tons.
Yeah, and I don't want you, and honestly for the exam, I don't want you to worry about two of them. Have a passing familiarity with some of them, but there are so many of them out there. Even Radius messages, which we'll get into in the next episode. We'll talk about Radius a little bit more. You can even do encapsulate Radius messages inside of EAP framework too.
Well, let's shift our focus away from EAP for a little bit, and let's talk about a nice little protocol called 802.1X. Right? You got to do the X. I think that's. It's by law.
Yeah, absolutely. That was probably in the
notes. Is an interesting and very widely used security protocol for authentication as well.
Yes, it is. It's primarily used in wireless networks, but it can be in wired networks too. And it's basically, if we look at 802.1X, I know I got a blank screen up here, but I want to focus on that number real quick because a little bit of an exam alert. This is not 802.11X. All right, 802.11 is the wireless LAN implementation standards by the IEEE. You will see sometimes in context when they're talking about all of the wireless family, they use X as a variable. They say 802.11X. That means that we could be talking about A, B, G, AC, AX, AD, and all the other varieties. They're just saying the whole family. This is 802.1X, all right? And what does it boil down to? Really, it's port-based authentication. All right, so if I'm going to talk to an authentication server, right, and I'm going to send an authentication request to an endpoint, I probably have to be already on your network, right, to talk to the authentication device that's in your network. That'd be bad, right? So port-based authentication, what it does is it uses a few components. It uses what's known as a supplicant. It uses what's known as an authenticator and an authentication server. Now, let's try that a little bit more. Let's see how it looks on the landscape, all right? You've got these components. Here's your supplicant, here's your authenticator, and here's the authentication server.
You get some big words going on the screen there, Wes.
Absolutely. You want to make it a little bit more...
Yeah, let's boil it down for those of us that are having trouble.
Yes, sir.
This is the kind of stuff that kind of burns my biscuits when it comes to IT, is we can try to outsmart ourselves a lot of times.
Just technical jargon.
And it's just technical jargon that could really be simply explained or better labeled, in my estimation. A lot of times we use things like supplicant. You've got wireless client going up, right? Yeah,
something like that.
This is real life, man. Wes has the technical terms on his graph there, and then he has the real things that people say.
That's right. That's right. So, Dan, I need you to figure out the supplicant. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the person that's got a wireless laptop that just tried to connect to your network.
Can't we just say that?
Right. So, yeah, we can absolutely do that, Dan. So the terms, maybe something that you're a little bit more familiar with, is a wireless. That's a supplicant. It's a wireless client. It literally could be, now, hear me out on this. I say a cell phone. It's not connected to the cellular network when I say that, but it's got a Wi-Fi connection to your network. That's any wireless device, right? And now what a wireless device does is it's going to actually communicate with the authenticator. Now, the authenticator could be one of a couple of things. It could be an 802.1X compliant access point, or in this case, it could be a wireless LAN controller. You might see the term WLC, an 802.1X compliant WLC. If you remember for your Network Plus days, if you took Network Plus, a wireless LAN controller is just when you have thousands of access points, right? You don't want to have to go, we talk about centralized administration, and I know we've touched base on that. It's one of the reasons we want that centralized administration, because it lowers the administrative overhead or burden, the headache, if you will.
That's a better word.
Yeah, burden. That's right. So the wireless LAN controller just coordinates all of these access points. And what happens is it'll actually lock that port down, and then the 802.1X device will turn around and it'll talk to the authentication server. So you don't even make your way into our network until we've talked to the authentication server. Now, what the authentication server is going to do is it's going to do two things here, all right? It's going to pass actually a challenge back to the supplicant through the authenticator. At this point, think of the authenticator as kind of like the gatekeeper. All right, you want to talk to somebody? Yeah, let me go make sure Tony's here. I'll close the door on you. I'll go talk to Tony. Not really, but and I don't know why I mentioned Tony, but
I'm naming my next Radius server Tony.
You better name it Tony, right? So it basically says, let's close the door. I'll go talk to the Radius server here, and the Radius server is going to say, well, sure. Tony's saying, ask that person who you are. All right, and that's a Radius challenge. In this case, a lot of times it's going to be used with like a Radius server, and there's a challenge that's going to be made back to the supplicant, or in this case, the wireless client. Then the wireless client responds back to the challenge. How do they do that? I'm going to type a username and password, all right? And then that goes back through the authenticator. Again, think of it as the gatekeeper, back to the authentication server, and the Radius server says, oh, okay, yeah, I got you. That's Dan. All right. And then sends an acceptance message. The port opens up, and now you make a connection to the network. This is essentially what 802.1X is. So keep this in mind. EAP, it's a framework for authentication. Many different methods. There's a bunch of them, and thank you, Dan, for helping me out on there. There's tons of them, right? The ones that we kind of focused on here in our episode here are the ones that I want you to be aware of for the exam. Know where exactly they might apply. We gave you some examples as well. And know what 802.1X is. It is a port-based authentication. Down at the physical level, we can close the electrical current off to the port while we go talk to the person that we need to talk to. If that person says, who are you? And you pass that test, port opens up, you gain connectivity to the wireless network. These are some of the things I'd keep in mind for that Security Plus exam.
Great words of wisdom spoken by our mentor, Mr. Wes Bryan. We thank him for that. Looks like we're at the end of this episode, though. Many, many more to come in our Security Plus series, so we hope to see you there. But as for this one, we're going to call it a day, and thank you for watching. Signing off. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.